Overnight, between the 12th and 13th of July, the waters of the Sea of Azov turned into a hunting ground. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces launched one of the largest coordinated drone raids of the summer, striking 15 vessels tied to what has become known as Russia's Shadow Fleet. 7 tankers, 5 dry cargo ships, 1 ferry, 2 tugboats. 15 targets, hit in a single night, in a campaign that shows no sign of slowing down. The man behind the announcement is Robert Brovdi, known across the front and across social media by his call sign, Madyar. He commands Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, a branch of the military built almost entirely around remote and autonomous weapons, and he has become one of the most recognizable voices of this new phase of the war. Brovdi framed the overnight operation as part of a much larger campaign, one he has nicknamed Operation Molochka, a Ukrainian word that roughly translates to something like dairy or milk run, a darkly playful name for what has become a systematic dismantling of Russian maritime logistics in the Azov and northern Black Sea. According to Brovdi, this was not an isolated event. It was the latest strike in an 8-day offensive that began on the 6th of July. Add up every vessel hit since then, and the total climbs to 105 ships struck in just over a week. That is not a typo, and it is not an exaggeration lifted from wartime propaganda without basis. It is the figure released by the commander himself, and it lines up with a string of nightly updates that have been trickling out of Kyiv for days, each one describing another wave of small, cheap, explosive drones descending on an anchorage packed with tankers and freighters. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what the Shadow Fleet actually is. Since the West imposed sanctions and a price cap on Russian oil exports following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Moscow has leaned on an enormous, loosely organized armada of aging tankers to keep its energy exports flowing. These are ships that often sail without proper insurance, flying flags of convenience from countries that ask few questions, owned through shell companies that are difficult to trace, and frequently switching off their transponders to avoid being tracked. Analysts sometimes call it the Dark Fleet or the Ghost Fleet. The purpose is simple: to move Russian oil and increasingly other cargo destined for occupied Crimea in a way that dodges Western sanctions and insurance requirements. Some of these vessels are decades old, poorly maintained, and represent not just a sanctions loophole, but a genuine environmental hazard, since a spill from an uninsured, poorly crewed tanker could be catastrophic, and nobody would be clearly on the hook to pay for the cleanup. For Ukraine, this fleet is not just a financial target, it is a military one too. Many of the vessels operating in the Sea of Azov are not simply exporting Russian crude to distant buyers. They are the lifeline for occupied Crimea, hauling fuel, construction materials, and military supplies across the narrow waters that separate Russian-controlled territory from the peninsula Moscow annexed in 2014. Cut that lifeline, and you don't just dent an oil company's balance sheet, you choke off the logistics that keep Russian forces in Crimea supplied and operational. That is precisely the logic behind the past week and a half of strikes. On the night of the 6th into the 7th of July, Ukrainian drone units hit 10 ships in a raid that later drew attention from naval analysts, including 8 tankers, a bulk cargo vessel, and a ferry. Days later, on the night of the 7th into the 8th, Unmanned Systems Forces units struck 19 tankers in a single operation in the Sea of Azov. Then on the 10th into the 11th, the tally jumped again, with 28 vessels of the Shadow Fleet hit overnight. By the 12th, Brovdi was reporting 14 more vessels struck, including 10 tankers and 4 ferries. And then came the raid on the night of the 12th into the 13th, the 15-ship operation that brought the 8-day total to 105. Numbers like that are worth sitting with for a moment because they represent a shift in how this war is being fought at sea. For the first year and a half of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine had no navy to speak of in any traditional sense. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, based out of Sevastopol, dominated the water, and early in the war it looked like Ukraine's coastline would simply be at Moscow's mercy. Then came a string of asymmetric strikes that reshaped the entire naval balance. The sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet in April of 2022, using Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles, was an early sign that Ukraine intended to fight back on the water, despite having almost nothing that could be called a navy. What followed was a steady evolution toward uncrewed surface vessels, essentially remote-controlled speedboats packed with explosives, that Ukraine used to strike Russian warships, the Kerch Bridge, and eventually to force much of the Black Sea Fleet to retreat from Sevastopol to more distant, safer harbors like Novorossiysk. By some estimates, Ukraine's uncrewed surface vessel campaign, combined with missile strikes, damaged or destroyed roughly a third of Russia's Black Sea Fleet within the first 2 years of full-scale war. An extraordinary outcome for a country that started the conflict without a meaningful navy at all. What has happened over this past several weeks appears to be the next chapter of that same story. But the target set has shifted from warships to the Shadow Fleet itself, and the tool of choice has shifted too, from uncrewed surface vessels to swarms of aerial strike drones operating over the water. Ukraine's drone forces, organized in units like the 414th Unmanned Strike Aviation Brigade, sometimes referred to informally as Madyar's birds, have spent months building out long-range strike drone capability, and the Sea of Azov raids are the clearest demonstration yet of what that capability looks like when applied systematically, night after night, against a slow-moving, poorly defended, and highly valuable set of targets. Tankers and cargo ships are not warships. They don't carry the kind of layered air defense that a frigate or a destroyer would. Many of them are old, low in the water, moving at a crawl, and anchored in tight formations, waiting to load or unload. That makes them, from a purely tactical standpoint, remarkably vulnerable to the kind of small, low-cost aerial drones that Ukraine has been mass-producing throughout the war. A strike drone that costs a few $1,000s can put a hole in the hull or set fire to the deck of a tanker worth many millions. And if you can do that 15 times in a single night, the economics of the entire Shadow Fleet operation start to look very different for Moscow. Brovdi's statement went further than just the vessel count, though. He also claimed that Ukrainian forces destroyed 4 Russian air defense assets during the same window of operations. That list included an S-400 Triumph launcher, considered one of the most advanced long-range surface-to-air missile systems in the Russian arsenal, a Tor system, which is a shorter-range mobile air defense platform typically used to protect point targets like airfields or command posts from aircraft, missiles, and drones, and 2 radar installations. If accurate, the loss of an S-400 launcher in particular would be a meaningful blow. The S-400 family is one of the backbone systems of Russia's integrated air defense network, and previous Ukrainian strikes on S-400 systems in Crimea have been treated as significant events precisely because these systems are expensive, not easily replaced, and their absence opens gaps that can be exploited by everything from strike drones to fixed-wing aircraft to longer-range missiles. Taking down a Tor system and radar installations alongside it suggests Ukrainian forces were not simply picking off ships in isolation, but running a broader operation aimed at degrading the air defense umbrella that would otherwise be protecting those ships, the ports they use, and nearby Russian military infrastructure in occupied Crimea. That detail matters for understanding how these operations actually work in practice. Striking 15 ships in open water in a single night without losing the bulk of your drones to air defense fire generally requires either overwhelming the defenders with sheer numbers or first suppressing the systems that would otherwise shoot the drones down, or some combination of both. The claimed destruction of air defense hardware in the same reporting period suggests Ukraine may be doing exactly that, using some drones to hunt radar and missile systems, clearing lanes and then sending follow-on waves after the ships themselves. Alongside the maritime and air defense claims, Brovdi also described a parallel operation targeting Crimea's electrical grid, an effort he referred to as the Crimean switch-off. According to his account, Ukrainian drones struck 9 power substations of varying capacity across occupied Crimea and other occupied territories over the course of the 12th and 13th of July. More significantly, he said the strikes also hit what he described as the strategic power transfer facility for the Kuban to Crimea energy bridge, the infrastructure link that carries electricity from Russia's Kuban region on the mainland side of the Kerch Strait into the occupied peninsula. This is worth unpacking because Crimea's relationship with the Russian energy grid has been a point of vulnerability since well before this current campaign. When Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014, Crimea's electricity supply had historically come largely from mainland Ukraine. After the annexation, and especially after Ukraine cut that supply in the years that followed, Crimea became dependent on undersea and overland power lines, connecting it to Russia's own grid through the Kerch Strait, the same energy bridge referenced in Brovdi's statement. That bridge, along with the physical Kerch Strait Bridge carrying road and rail traffic, has functioned as one of the most important arteries tying occupied Crimea to Russia proper. If Ukrainian strikes are now capable of disrupting the transfer stations along that energy corridor, even temporarily, it represents pressure on a piece of infrastructure that Russia has spent years trying to protect and reinforce, precisely because its loss would be felt immediately by both the civilian population and the military infrastructure on the peninsula. Brovdi's claim that these attacks disrupted operations on the peninsula should be read for what it is, a claim from one side of an active war, made for both operational and morale purposes. It has not been independently verified in granular detail at the time of this reporting, and claims like this, made by military commanders in the middle of an ongoing campaign, deserve the same healthy skepticism that any wartime claim deserves, whether it comes from Kiev or from Moscow. But it is consistent with a broader, well-documented pattern. Independent analysts, including those at the Institute for the Study of War, have noted a sharp drop in the number of Russian vessels operating in the Sea of Azov over the course of this campaign, with estimates suggesting the total fell by more than half between late June and mid-July, from roughly 267 vessels down to around 120. Separately, there have been reports that Russia temporarily suspended shipping through the Don to Azov Canal and through the Kerch Strait itself in the wake of the strikes, a move that would only make sense if the ships operating in those waters were, in fact, under sustained and credible threat. It's also worth putting the Kerch Strait itself in context, because it is not just a shipping lane. It is arguably the single most important logistical choke point connecting Russia to occupied Crimea. The physical bridge across the strait, opened in 2018 as a signature project of the annexation, carries both a road and a rail line, and it has already been struck multiple times over the course of the war, each time forcing repairs and each time serving as a symbol of how exposed Russia's hold on Crimea actually is, despite years of fortification. The strait itself is narrow, shallow in places, and heavily trafficked, which makes it both strategically vital and tactically difficult to defend against a determined, technologically capable adversary using large numbers of small, hard-to-detect drones. If transport infrastructure around the strait is now facing regular drone attacks in addition to the pressure on shipping further out in the Azov, it suggests Ukraine is trying to squeeze the connection between Russia and Crimea from multiple angles at once: the ships that carry goods across the water, the power lines that keep the lights on, and the fixed transport infrastructure that ties it all together. Stepping back from the details of any single night's operation, there's a broader story here about how this war has evolved. When the full-scale invasion began in February of 2022, most assessments of the conflict focused on tanks, artillery, and infantry lines grinding across open fields in the east and south. 3.5 years later, some of the most consequential fighting is happening at long range, at night, using systems that would have been considered fringe or experimental at the war's outset. Cheap, first-person view drones costing a few hundred to a few $1,000s are now capable of threatening billion-dollar military assets, sinking or disabling tankers worth tens of millions, and forcing an adversary with a vastly larger, conventional military to alter its entire logistics posture. Ukraine, lacking a traditional navy, has effectively built a new kind of maritime power from scratch, one based on uncrewed surface vessels for open water strikes against warships, and now increasingly on long-range aerial strike drones for sustained pressure on shipping, ports, and coastal infrastructure. This has forced Russia to adapt, and it has adapted in ways that are visible if you know where to look. The retreat of much of the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, further from Ukrainian strike range, was one such adaptation. Increased reliance on the Shadow Fleet itself, with its opaque ownership and flags of convenience, was partly a response to sanctions, but it also created a diffuse, hard-to-defend target set that is now being exploited by exactly the kind of drone campaign described in this report. Russian forces have also worked to bolster air defenses around key Crimean ports and infrastructure nodes, layering systems like the S-400 and Tor alongside radar coverage specifically to counter the drone threat. The fact that Ukraine claims to have destroyed some of that layered defense in the same period as the ship strikes suggests an ongoing back and forth, a contest between Russian efforts to protect the Shadow Fleet and Ukrainian efforts to strip away that protection piece by piece. There is also an economic dimension to all of this that is easy to overlook if you focus only on the military details. The Shadow Fleet exists because of sanctions, and its entire purpose is to keep Russian oil revenue flowing, despite a Western price cap and insurance restrictions designed to limit that revenue. Every tanker that gets damaged or destroyed is not just a military loss, it is a direct hit to the machinery Russia has built to fund its war effort. Insurance for Shadow Fleet vessels is already difficult and expensive to obtain given their murky ownership structures. A sustained campaign of drone strikes makes that insurance calculation even worse, potentially driving up costs, discouraging operators from entering the Sea of Azov at all, and forcing Russia to either accept reduced throughput or pour more resources into defending a fleet that was designed, from the start, to operate under the radar rather than under a shield of armed protection. None of this happens in a vacuum either. Sea of Azov shipping isn't just about crude oil bound for distant refineries. A significant portion of the traffic in and out of ports like Mariupol, Berdyansk, and others under Russian control involves grain, construction materials, and other goods tied directly to the occupation, and, in some cases, to alleged efforts to extract resources from occupied Ukrainian territory. Disrupting that traffic carries implications beyond pure military logistics, touching on the broader economic exploitation of occupied areas that has been documented by international monitors throughout the war. It's important, in a report like this, to be honest about the limits of what can be verified from the outside. Everything described here about the specific number of ships hit, the identity and quantity of air defense systems destroyed, and the extent of disruption to Crimea's power grid comes from statements made by a Ukrainian military commander in the middle of an active information war. Ukraine has strong incentives to publicize successful strikes, both to boost domestic and international morale and to signal capability to Moscow and to Kiev's Western partners, who are weighing continued military support. That doesn't mean the claims are false. In fact, independent indicators, like the documented drop in vessel numbers in the Sea of Azov tracked by outside analysts, and reports of Russia suspending shipping through key waterways, lend real credibility to the broad shape of what's being described, even if the precise tallies of ships and systems destroyed can't be independently confirmed, sortie by sortie. Video footage has also been released showing drone strikes on vessels in the water, offering visual corroboration of at least some of the claimed attacks, even though footage alone can't confirm every detail of a broader campaign spanning more than a week and well over 100 vessels. What can be said with more confidence is that the overall trend lines are consistent and have been building for weeks, not appearing out of nowhere on a single night. The escalation from 10 ships hit on the 6th and 7th of July, to 19 on the 7th and 8th, to 28 on the 10th and 11th, to 14 on the 12th, and finally to 15 more on the night of the 12th into the 13th, describes a sustained operational tempo rather than a single headline-grabbing raid. That kind of consistency, night after night, across more than a week, is much harder to fabricate or exaggerate convincingly than a single dramatic claim would be, and it aligns with what outside observers are independently tracking in terms of reduced Russian shipping activity in the region. Looking ahead, the strategic question is what this campaign means for the broader war. If Ukraine can sustain this tempo, and if the trend of a shrinking Russian shadow fleet presence in the Sea of Azov continues, the practical effect will be felt most acutely in Crimea itself, in the availability of fuel, construction materials, and military supplies on a peninsula that has always been logistically dependent on connections across the water and across the Kerch Strait. Combine that pressure with parallel strikes on the Crimea to Cuban power infrastructure, and you get a picture of a campaign designed not around a single decisive blow, but around cumulative attrition. Fewer ships able to safely operate, higher insurance and operating costs for those that do, degraded air defense coverage protecting the routes they use, and periodic disruption to the electrical grid that keeps ports, military bases, and civilian infrastructure on the peninsula running. Russia, for its part, is unlikely to simply absorb this without response. Expected continued efforts to reinforce air defenses around key Crimean ports and the Kerch Strait corridor, potential further dispersal of shadow fleet operations to reduce concentration of vessels in any one anchorage, and continued diplomatic and economic efforts to prop up the shadow fleet system despite the mounting losses. Whether Russia can adapt quickly enough to blunt this drone campaign the way it eventually adapted to the earlier threat from Ukrainian uncrewed surface vessels remains an open question, one that will likely play out over the coming weeks, as both sides continue to test and adjust their approaches in the contested waters of the Sea of Azov and the northern Black Sea. It's also worth spending a moment on the technology itself, because the story of this campaign is really the story of a quiet revolution in how smaller powers can contest control of the sea against a much larger conventional force. Traditional naval warfare has always favored the side with more ships, bigger guns, and deeper pockets. Ukraine had none of those advantages when the full-scale invasion began, and in the years since, it has essentially had to invent a new playbook rather than try to compete on Russia's terms. Long-range aerial strike drones used in operations like this one are typically small, propeller-driven aircraft, often built domestically in Ukraine at a fraction of the cost of a cruise missile, capable of flying low, evading much of the radar coverage, designed to catch faster, higher-flying threats and carrying an explosive payload sufficient to start a fire, breach a hull, or disable a ship's propulsion. They are not precision-guided in the way a Western cruise missile might be, but they don't need to be, because the targets in question, tankers and cargo ships anchored or moving slowly through a relatively confined body of water, don't require pinpoint accuracy to hit. What they require is persistence, numbers, and a willingness to accept that many of the drones launched on any given night will fail to reach their target, whether due to interception, mechanical failure, or simple bad luck. A campaign like the one described here, hitting 15 ships in a single night, likely involved the launch of considerably more drones than that, with only a portion of them actually finding and striking a vessel. This numbers game favors Ukraine in a way that few other aspects of the war do. Producing a strike drone is measured in the thousands of dollars, not the millions, and Ukraine has spent much of the past 2 years scaling up domestic drone manufacturing, specifically because of this cost asymmetry. Russia, meanwhile, has to defend an enormous and geographically spread out set of targets, from the Kerch Strait to Crimean ports, to the shadow fleet vessels themselves scattered across the Sea of Azov, with air defense systems that are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and impossible to place everywhere at once. Every S-400 launcher or Tor system lost to a Ukrainian strike, as claimed in this latest round of operations, represents an asset that cannot simply be replaced overnight, And every hour that Russian air defense crews spend focused on defending shipping lanes in the Azov is an hour they are not spending reinforcing other parts of the front. This is the essential logic of asymmetric warfare at sea. Force the larger, wealthier adversary into a defensive posture where it must protect everything, while the smaller, more agile side only needs to find the gaps. There is useful historical context here too, stretching back well before the current campaign. The Sea of Azov has long been treated by Russia as something close to an internal lake, particularly after the 2018 opening of the Kerch Strait Bridge gave Moscow physical and administrative control over the only entrance and exit to those waters. In the years following the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russian authorities restricted Ukrainian naval and commercial access to Azov ports like Mariupol, part of a broader pattern of pressure on Ukraine's southeastern coastline that predated the full-scale invasion by years. The 2018 seizure of Ukrainian naval vessels near the Kerch Strait, an incident that drew international condemnation at the time, was an early sign of just how much strategic weight Moscow placed on controlling that narrow waterway. Fast forward to the current war, and the Sea of Azov has become fully enclosed Russian-controlled water, at least on paper, bounded by occupied Mariupol and other Ukrainian territory seized since 2022 on one side, and Russian mainland territory and occupied Crimea on the other. That made it, for a long stretch of the war, one of the safer areas for Russian shipping to operate, precisely because it was fully surrounded by Russian or Russian-occupied coastline and seemingly out of reach of the kind of strikes Ukraine could carry out, further out in the open Black Sea. The drone campaign described in this report upends that assumption. If Ukrainian strike drones can now reach deep into the Sea of Azov night after night, hitting dozens of vessels over the course of little more than a week, then the sense of sanctuary Russia has relied on in those waters has effectively been broken. That is arguably the most significant strategic takeaway from this entire episode, more significant even than the raw vessel count. It's not just that Ukraine sank or damaged a large number of ships in a short period of time. It's that Ukraine demonstrated the ability to do so inside a body of water that Russia had every reason to believe was secure, ringed by occupied territory, protected by air defense systems, and far enough from the front lines to feel insulated from exactly this kind of sustained pressure. Naval analysts and open-source researchers tracking the conflict have also pointed to a related pattern worth noting. The shift in Ukrainian targeting from primarily military vessels earlier in the war toward the Shadow Fleet and dual-use logistics ships more recently. Early in the conflict, headline strikes tended to involve identifiable warships like the Moskva or high-profile targets like the Kerch Bridge itself. The current campaign looks different. Tankers, dry cargo vessels, ferries, and tugboats are not warships, and many of them are technically civilian registered, even if their cargo and purpose serve Russian military and occupation logistics. Targeting them raises its own set of complicated questions about the laws of naval warfare, questions that are likely to be debated by international lawyers and human rights monitors, even as the strikes continue. Ukraine's position, consistently articulated by officials including Brovdi, is that these vessels are not neutral commercial shipping, but an active part of Russia's sanctions evasion and military supply network, making them legitimate targets in the context of the ongoing war. Russia and its allies would obviously dispute that characterization, and independent legal assessments of individual strikes have generally lagged behind the pace of the campaign itself. Whatever the legal debate, the practical military and economic effects are becoming harder to dispute with each passing night. A shrinking, increasingly cautious Shadow Fleet means higher costs and greater uncertainty for anyone still willing to sail into the Sea of Azov, which in turn means slower resupply for occupied Crimea, more strain on the already stretched Kerch Strait crossing, and mounting pressure on a sanctions evasion system that Russia spent years quietly building specifically to withstand this kind of scrutiny and disruption. Combined with strikes on the Crimea to Cuban power infrastructure, air defense assets, and transport nodes around the strait itself, the picture that emerges is one of a coordinated, multi-domain effort to isolate the peninsula, not through a single dramatic operation, but through the kind of grinding, repeated pressure that adds up over days and weeks rather than hours. For now, the numbers speak for themselves, even accounting for the fog of war that surrounds any wartime announcement. 15 vessels in a single night, 105 in 8 days, 9 substations, and a strategic power transfer facility struck in the same window. An S-400 launcher, a Tor system, and 2 radar installations claimed destroyed. Whatever the precise final tally turns out to be once the dust settles, and independent analysts have had time to cross-reference satellite imagery, shipping data, and on-the-ground reporting, the broad picture is unmistakable. Ukraine's drone forces have opened a sustained, multi-pronged campaign against the infrastructure that keeps occupied Crimea supplied. And after more than 3 years of war, that campaign is being fought not with warships or tank columns, but with swarms of low-cost drones operating night after night over some of the most contested water in Europe. It's also worth considering what this campaign signals to the outside world, beyond the immediate battlefield calculus. For Ukraine's Western partners, sustained operational success of this kind is likely to factor into ongoing debates about military assistance, sanctions enforcement, and how much longer-term capability Kyiv has built independent of direct foreign supply. A campaign built primarily on domestically produced drones rather than imported precision missiles demonstrates a degree of self-sufficiency that matters both militarily and politically, particularly at a moment when the pace and certainty of Western aid has periodically come into question. It also reinforces a point that sanctions enforcement bodies in the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom have been making for some time. That the Shadow Fleet is not just a Russian problem to manage quietly through paperwork and price caps, but an active, physically vulnerable network that can be degraded through direct military pressure as well as financial and regulatory means. Whether that changes the calculus in Washington, Brussels, or London around further sanctions, designations targeting Shadow Fleet, operators, insurers, and flag registries remains to be seen, but the timing of this campaign, arriving alongside continued diplomatic wrangling over enforcement of the oil price cap, is unlikely to be lost on policymakers watching from the outside. There is also a human dimension worth acknowledging, even in a report focused primarily on military logistics and vessel counts. Every tanker or cargo ship struck in these operations has a crew aboard, often composed of sailors from third countries with little direct stake in the war, drawn into the Shadow Fleet trade by wages and contracts rather than by any allegiance to Moscow's war aims. Reports from earlier strikes on Shadow Fleet vessels throughout the war have periodically raised questions about crew safety, evacuation procedures, and the broader ethics of a sanctions evasion system that puts ordinary seafarers in the path of an active military campaign without necessarily informing them of the risk they're taking on when they sign aboard an aging, poorly insured tanker bound for a war zone anchorage. That dimension rarely makes it into official military statements from either side, but it's a thread worth keeping in mind as this campaign continues and the vessel counts keep climbing. As for what comes next, the honest answer is that nobody outside the operational commands on either side knows for certain. Wars of attrition like this one tend to move in cycles, a period of intense pressure from one side, followed by adaptation and a partial recovery from the other, followed eventually by a fresh escalation once new tactics or technology tip the balance again. Ukraine's drone forces have clearly found something that is working, at least for now, and the cumulative toll of over 100 vessels struck in little more than a week represents a real and significant disruption to Russian maritime logistics in the Sea of Azov, whatever the exact final numbers turn out to be. Whether Moscow can adapt quickly enough to blunt that pressure, whether Ukraine can sustain the operational tempo required to keep it up night after night, and whether the broader trajectory of the war shifts as a result, are all questions that will only be answered by watching what happens over the days and weeks that follow. For now, what is clear is this. The waters around occupied Crimea, once considered some of the safest for Russian shipping anywhere in the theater, no longer feel safe at all, and that shift alone marks a meaningful moment in a war that continues to evolve in ways few predicted when the first missiles fell in February of 2022.